Hi everybody, my name is Jonathan Fields. We're here with the Good Life Project. So my guest today is Pamela Miles. Pamela is a Reiki master, an educator, and an author. Somebody who's done some extraordinary work, especially integrating Reiki with what we would call, I guess, modern sort of Western medicine. So we're going to dive into that whole journey with her. It's awesome to be hanging out with you today.
It's great to be here, Jonathan.
So I have to start with one really basic question, which is Reiki. So I've been in and out of the world of yoga and meditation and sort of integrative healing and things like that. I've heard the word Reiki many, many times before and known and spoken with many people who sort of work in the field. I still don't fully understand what it is. And I'm sure a lot of people out here are sort of in a similar place. So I think maybe that's a good place to start.
Good. Yeah, there's a real product recognition problem with Reiki, partially because there are no standards or any kind of regulation around the practice. And I'm not saying there should be, but it means that people can be doing anything that they understand to be Reiki, and it's hard for the public, and it's hard for healthcare. But what Reiki started as, and for traditional practitioners such as myself continues to be, is actually a spiritual healing practice. Somewhat like meditation, except that it's easier. And I say that as somebody who's been meditating for many years and loves to meditate. But for most people, Reiki practice is a little more accessible. It's a good beginning.
Well, I mean, and I'm a meditator also. First thing I do every morning is I roll out of bed and I sit for 25 minutes. And I owned a yoga studio. I taught yoga and I taught meditation for years. And one of my dirty little secrets was that I had a brutal time actually doing it myself. So it's a powerful practice, but like you said, I think you were understating it even. It's a challenging practice for a lot. I think especially a lot of sort of like people that are more sort of Western minded, to wrap their head around and then to actually turn into a practice.
It's a little bit like going on a diet. You know, it takes a lot of discipline, a lot of consistency, and you're not even sure it's going to work for you. You know, you have to stick with it for a while before you see results. Whereas if you were a Reiki practitioner, you wouldn't have to roll out of bed. You could just place your hands on your body while your eyes are still closed, while you're half asleep, and, you know, have 20 or 30 minutes of transition time so that then you're more motivated to meditate. And in fact, that's what I hear from a lot of my students, that once they start feeling better, the payoff from Reiki practice is pretty fast. So they start feeling better, they start functioning better, and then they're motivated to do all the good things that they've been wanting to do for themselves, but they've really been kind of slapping themselves upside the head, you know, oh, why did I eat that? Or why can't I sit for meditation or whatever?
So, and the way you're sort of explaining it, because I want to go a little bit deeper too so I can get a better feel, is that it's not something that somebody does to you, it's something that maybe can somebody facilitate it, but you're saying you can do it to or with yourself?
The primary practice is self-care, yes. And with about 12 hours of usually group training, a person is able to place their hands through a series of placements on their body leisurely. You know, about 30 minutes is really good. Some people longer, depending upon what your need is. And feel this shift from within. That seems to be what Herbert Benson years ago dubbed the relaxation response, but which is in fact much more profound than that. Relaxation is important, but relaxation is just the beginning of healing. Yeah.
So what is the sort of the underlying theory about what's actually happening when you're actually experiencing Reiki, either through someone or through your own practice?
Again, there are lots of theories, and because it's a practice, we don't even really have to have a theory. We can just practice.
See, it's like funny, it's showing my orientation with sort of the questions that I'm asking, because I'm always looking for like, well, what's actually happening?
Well, when people ask, like in medicine, the question would be, what's the mechanism of action? And so my favorite response is, science does not yet know the mechanism of action. We have to be really upfront about that. And there hasn't been an enormous amount of good research into what's happening when people practice Reiki. But what we have seen supports what I said about the relaxation response. We see that blood pressure normalizes, heart rate improves. A very important quantitative measure, something that is actually scientifically measurable, not just people saying, I feel better, because they do say that. Mm-hmm. The two things we hear most often is, I have less pain and I feel less anxious, or not at all anxious. Those are the two qualitative responses to Reiki practice. But a very exciting measurement has been the improvement in heart rate variability that we documented in some research I did at Yale. That was published in a conventional cardiac journal a couple years ago. Without getting too technical, heart rate variability is a very, very important thing to improve in people who have had a heart attack, because when it's flat, it's the single strongest predictor of death from another heart attack. Because when it's flat, it means that the system has no resilience in it. And in nature, we see that we're dynamic systems, and we can withstand a little bit of stress and maybe even do better with a little bit of stress. A little bit of challenge strengthens the immune system and such. But when we have too much stress over too long a period of time, the system gets exhausted. It starts coping, and when the system starts coping, it stops healing. It can't do both at the same time. And this is why stress is such a problem. And so what we found was that with just 20 minutes of nurses who had been trained placing their hands to give the patients a modified Reiki treatment, just 20 minutes, Jonathan, we saw an improvement in heart rate variability that's comparable to beta blockers.
Which is huge.
It's huge. And, like any good piece of research, it opened up more questions than it answered. Right. But it's very exciting that there is something that we can do that is non-invasive, that doesn't involve drugs, that doesn't involve needles, and that can give that quick of a response. It's very exciting in cardiology. This was in the cardiac ICU. Mm-hmm. But it's also exciting for everybody, because heart rate variability is a measurement that is meaningful for anyone. It shows that your system, if your heart rate variability is flat, your system is stressed, is just about maxed out, no matter whether you've just had a heart attack or you're headed towards one, or
so
some other problem.
It's a generic marker for potential disease.
It is a shorthand for a system that is losing resilience, losing its ability to regain balance. And this is something that has been proposed by a wonderful researcher at the Rockefeller University, a guy named Bruce McEwen, who, like many accomplished scientists, has been very generous with me to sit down and make sure that I really understood the science of their work as much as a layperson can. And I said, just tell me if this is correct. The body either copes or it heals. And he said, yes, because the coping is good in the short term. But then the body starts reorganizing its functioning around coping, and that shuts down the healing processes that should be taking place primarily at night when we're in deep sleep. Because one of the side effects of coping, you could guess this, is poor sleep. It's one of the first things. I mean, we actually start breathing less efficiently, but we don't notice that. But we start not sleeping well, and that's a real problem.
So let's deconstruct coping a little bit, because in I think probably most people's experience, they've looked at the word cope as a good thing. Well, like, I've got these coping mechanisms. I've learned how to cope with, these really challenging scenarios. So tell me a little bit about how what does the word coping mean in this conversation?
Coping, the ability to cope is a hallmark of a healthy system. But when coping becomes lifestyle, that's a problem. Because coping, you could say, is the ability to withstand stress.
Okay.
But that doesn't mean that it's good to live in a very stressful lifestyle or environment forever. What we know is when people are living with prolonged stressors, even if they're not traumatic stressors, if they're prolonged, that the system kind of acclimates to an unhealthy condition. So that kind of coping is not good, because then, for example, our bloodstreams are full of degenerative stress hormones.
So it's kind of fascinating because, I guess we almost sort of have to take a step back and say, like you say, coping is good, but if the circumstance that gives rise to the need to cope becomes sustained over time,
exactly,
then that the entire system, coping and circumstance, is destructive.
That's right. It creates a degenerative condition in the inner physiologic environment.
And what you're saying is that is the antithesis of your body's natural ability to heal whatever it needs to heal.
Yes, because coping mechanisms are not healing mechanisms.
Which I guess and then the flip side of that, and tell me if this is, because I really want to understand sort of like the whole, is that left to sort of be in its calmest, most sort of like grounded state, that our body has essentially what it needs to be able to repair itself and bring itself back to health and vitality.
Yeah, our bodies are remarkable kind of self-cleaning ovens, if we take care of them.
I'm just like visualizing that. Set it up.
And in traditional medical systems, as distinct from conventional medicine, medical systems like Ayurveda and Chinese medicine, Tibetan medicine, that are based on traditions that predate science, they value the sleep that happens between 10 p.m. and 2 a.m. in particular. To be asleep then, to be sleeping deeply, to have an empty stomach, because if you've got food in your stomach, you go to digest that. It's like a natural triage. That's the first thing that has to happen. But if our state is good, if our systems are balanced, then that's when we digest the rest of our lives. Remember I said Reiki is a spiritual healing practice? So the spiritual part comes in being able to digest our lives, the challenging parts, the unfair parts, the agony, and come to a relationship of meaning with it and choose to use it to our advantage. I remember one of my teachers said the yogi is the ultimate opportunist. Always choosing whatever's happening as an opportunity to transform oneself, one's understanding.
Yeah, and I think it's such a different perspective on healing from a Western standpoint, which is largely somebody does something to you to fix you, right, rather than we're in control.
Well, and I think that's why I do so well with surgeons, because surgeons really are like mechanics, and they're not known for their bedside manner. How can I say this? Because I love surgeons. I enjoy working with them. But when I say they're mechanics, they know what they have to do, and they know when their work is finished, and the patient's system has to take over. So the boundary around their practice is very clear-cut, whereas the boundary around the practice of a family physician or an oncologist, for example, it's not so clear. Well, maybe there's something else we could do, and also surgeons typically don't have any way to engage their patients in their self-healing.
They're unconscious.
Right, and they don't spend a lot of time with them when they are conscious, But they go to the patient's room usually the next morning to see how they're doing, and they've done this hundreds, if not thousands of times. So they know what the healing curve is like for the surgeries that they do. And when they see a patient the next morning, who is where most patients are 3 days after surgery, they notice. They notice that, and of course, they think it's because they're such a good surgeon, which is fine with me. But they often will comment, wow, I've never seen, one of my clients just had bowel surgery and was out of the hospital 3 days later with full bowel function. And the specialist said, I've never seen a bowel repair and regain function that quickly. So they notice. They notice. And then some of them ask questions. It's remarkable, though, how many of them don't. They're just content to notice.
So talk to me a little bit about how because what's fascinating, too, is you take this very intangible practice and not easy to sort of clearly identify the mechanisms, and you bring it into a world where, because you operate largely in the world of modern medicine, so you're bringing it into a world which is defined by the exact opposite ethic and sort of approach. I have so many questions about that, but how did you start to actually be able to move into that world and decide, okay, I need to bring this into this other space, and then what was the reception?
Well, I didn't make that decision. I was invited, and it was 20 years ago. It was in the mid-90s, and we can thank the AIDS epidemic, because the AIDS epidemic, I would say, humbled conventional medicine in a way that it really had not been humbled, because of the rapidity of the growth and the futility of what they usually did, right. What doctors were usually able to offer. So I had been asked to set up a program at Gay Men's Health Crisis, in which I trained the members there to practice self-treatment. That's always been my main interest. I also give treatment, I'll put my hands on other
right.
people too, and I train professionals to do that, but I've always been really interested in teaching a person to fish instead of giving them a fish. And so the doctors in infectious disease started hearing the word Reiki and hearing about my program. And as one doctor who later became a student of mine said, whenever he saw a patient who was doing better than would be expected, because this was before the protease inhibitors, this was before the drugs that we have now. All medicine could do was to try to treat opportunistic infections and make people comfortable. And, these guys were dying a lot, and their friends were dying. They would hardly go a month without losing somebody. So they were sick, and they were in a state of chronic bereavement. And the medicines that were given to them often were very hard for their broken down systems to be able to address. So the doctors noticed, and when Beth Israel set up a complementary therapies program in their inner city outpatient infectious disease clinic, aka the AIDS clinic, I was asked to come in and be part of that. And I had to, I just had to, and it was not easy.
I bet. I can imagine.
Yeah, it was an easy decision because clearly I had to do this. There was so much suffering.
Right.
But personally, as somebody who had had a long-standing lifestyle of spiritual practice and traditional rather than conventional medicine, judicious use of conventional medicine, but really healthful lifestyle at a level that most people don't even realize is possible, for me to go in and think of those people, as colleagues, or think I would be respected, or, it was scary. And what I found was that from very early on, the doctors would pull me aside. It was as if once I was invited into the hospital, I had a big MD, honorary MD stamped on my forehead, and the doctors would pull me aside and say, my son has asthma and can't tolerate the medication. Do you think you could help him? My mother-in-law has cancer. She's dying. We know she's dying, but she has so much pain. Do you think you could help? You know, and what I realized as I lifted my jaw from the floor, you know, was of course they're open to all of this, because who sees more suffering than doctors and nurses? They see more suffering in a day than most of us see in a year or maybe a lifetime. And they know how much they are not able to help with the suffering. They can help with the medicine, but they often cannot address people's suffering directly. So it turned me around and made me very motivated to learn how to present the practice in a way that would make sense to them, because I saw they want it.
Right.
They want to know about this. They just knew, number one, that they didn't know how to tell a good practitioner because there's no licensing.
Right, there's no standardization, there's no...
Exactly.
Yeah.
And once they had a good practitioner, they didn't know what questions to ask because they saw the language barriers.
Right.
So I started learning as much as I could from their perspective, which wasn't so hard because my mother was a nurse, my sister is a nurse, my grandmother was a nurse. So, you know, I grew up with that kind of thinking and respected it.
Right. Which, now there's a whole nother conversation. Could go on for a long time. But let me ask this, and then I want to kind of come back to the track, which is growing up in a family where you've got a lot of modern medicine in the family. And you're sort of choosing a very alternative path. How was that dynamic in the family?
When I learned, I was a trained hypnotist, therapeutic hypnotist. When I learned that, I went home and I taught my parents self-hypnosis. Medicine was changing. It was becoming more and more technological and less personal than the medicine that my mother had practiced. And my parents were aging and they were suffering from this shift in medicine. And also my parents had always, they were both children of immigrants, so they had this do-it-yourself kind of attitude. You know, you don't go to the doctor instead of taking care of yourself. There was a different perspective on healthcare then. Healthcare was still in the home. And when you needed something, the pediatrician made house calls. So it was very different.
Right. So let's kind of zoom the lens back. You have your own healing practice. You're brought into the world of modern medicine through the AIDS epidemic and essentially a state of mass futility. Things just not working and people turning and saying, can this help? And then starting to realize that, wow, this is different. And then you were sharing that one of the big questions is, okay, we've experienced you. We trust you. You're doing something. But there are far more people out there that we need to help. How do we find more people like you and know that they're not charlatans, or know they know what they're doing, and especially when you're speaking the language of licensing and mechanics and all this, how did you navigate those conversations? It had to be really interesting.
What I try to do is educate hospital administration about the hallmarks of a credible Reiki professional. I am not in favor of regulation, and I can't imagine there ever being licensing, because everybody agrees that Reiki practice is non-invasive. You know, there's no reason to have to protect the public against harm in the way that there is maybe with massage, in a sense, because you're manipulating tissue. Mm-hmm. With Reiki practice, it's light touch or even off the body. And we're not asking people to ingest anything. We're not even putting anything on their skin. So according to the conventional medical paradigm, there are no known medical contraindications. This is something that may not be enough, may not even work, but it's not going to hurt anybody. And And doctors and nurses know that the patient who's getting more attention is generally a happier patient, and a happier patient is easier to treat.
Right.
So as long as Reiki practitioners are willing to adopt a way of carrying the practice and communicating the practice that can help bridge the cultures, I think that, we have reason to believe we can be successful with this. What we don't want is for Reiki practice to enter or spread, because it's already in conventional medicine, only through nurses or other licensed professionals who have taken a weekend training. And this is a problem because from their perspective, where they have so much knowledge that they have to learn to be able to do what they do, it can seem like, really? And now you're a Reiki professional? Because what they don't readily understand, and what the public doesn't readily understand, is, for one thing, the difference between self-practice, self-practice, home practice, easy. Being a professional involves a lot of other considerations, and one of them is learning what not to do. So when I place my hands, having practiced since 1986, I'm really only placing my hands. I'm not trying to make something happen. I'm not getting my innards all worked up. And so if you see a Reiki practitioner who practices daily self-treatment every day, that's what daily means, not 3 times a week, every day, the same way you would have a meditation practice, and has been doing that for a while, and is able to talk about what he or she does in a moderate tone. I always tell my professionals in training, lose the enthusiasm. It's hard because we know we have something that can help a lot of people, and we can hyperventilate about it. And that's why it's important for professionals to have a self-practice and let the practice change me first. And out of that, then I can offer it to other people. It's a very important step that too often is ignored.
Yeah, I know I've experienced that personally also. It's and it's interesting when I was, I think that so many times I saw this in the yoga world, where teachers would start to become popular. And as they would become popular, they'd be teaching here and teaching there, and then they would have 5 private clients. And their personal practice would start to get smaller and smaller and smaller, and then it would literally vanish. And they would find themselves empty, and they're out there, and I think self-care, or some variation of that phrase, is so important for everybody. But I think, especially for those who are in the profession of helping care for others, or teaching others how to care for themselves, you've got to have this wellspring. So you've got to constantly be filling your own tank, because it makes you much more effective at helping others.
Or a different image is balancing your system. Because the filling your own tank is actually a dualistic perspective. Like, I'm empty now, I can't give to anybody else. But I'm not giving them something, I'm giving them my presence, I'm placing my hands. And as long as I'm tending my state and maintaining the balance in my system, so that if it goes into coping mode, it comes back.
Right.
And I am healing, my system is functioning well, then I can help other people. When I teach in hospitals, and this is such a radical thing to say to hospital staff, but I say it relentlessly, the care of the patient begins with the care of the caregiver. We have to get out of this "it's you or me" perspective. And that's what Reiki practice offers nurses in particular, because they're more hands-on than doctors are. That the nurses that I've trained, they just let their hands linger on a patient during routine care.
And
so
there's no, I'm doing Reiki now, it's just
they're touching people. A lot of times the people that they're taking care of are so ill and uncomfortable that they don't need to be burdened with a whole other Reiki, but moments of Reiki touch can make a difference. And then if there's a point at which it goes into a full-on treatment, which really doesn't happen so much in conventional medicine because nurses don't have that kind of time. But then there certainly would be a conversation about informed consent. But in those moments, the nurse is also benefiting. When I place my hands on someone else, that person's system is responding to whatever it is that I carry in my hands, that all Reiki professionals, practitioners carry in their hands, but my system is also responding to that. So that's one of the things that the nurses comment on right away, is the first time they've done something for somebody else that didn't cost them their own vitality, that they felt uplifted as well, and to move self-care into conventional healthcare as a value,
It's huge because it's, I mean, if anything, it's the exact opposite. I have friends who are physicians or ER, surgeons or in the ER, and they're very often the people who take the absolute worst care of themselves.
Especially the ER professionals, they're real adrenaline junkies.
It's like the cowboys and cowgirls. Yeah.
Yes, so when I do a class in a hospital for staff, it's maybe 15, 16 hours, and we spend a lot of time on this. And typically hospitals will approach me and say, we want our staff to have to be able to practice Reiki on the patients, as part of integrating CAM into their toolbox, and will you teach them? And I say, no. Not like that.
And they're like, but we have money for you. It's like, it doesn't work that way.
But, you have a population of professionals who have a really high burnout rate. And what I can teach them is how to practice Reiki self-care. And out of that foundation, then yes, of course, we'll integrate it into care. But I need you to come on board with that as the primary value. Is that of interest to you? And of course they always say, well, yeah, they didn't even know that was possible because it's all about treatment. It's all about having somebody else do something to somebody else. It's like, no, we could do this for ourselves and we can share with others too.
Which is a powerful place to begin. You mentioned also that you've been involved in patients who are moving through surgery. What's sort of like, what would your role be in the surgical setting?
My relationship with each patient is different. I get to have a customized service, and it's customized according to what the patient wants, what the opportunities are. Can I get in the OR or not? Because some surgeons it's fine, some hospitals it's fine, sometimes it's not fine. So I would typically do some work with the patient even before the surgery, because you want your system to be as sound as possible. Even if you're ill, you can still improve.
Right.
So that you're in the best condition to withstand the trauma of surgery. And even life-saving surgery is incredibly traumatic. So there's the before, and then if possible I'll go with them to surgical holding, because there's a lot of anxiety as people wait to go into the OR. I'll either go into the OR or not, and then meet them in the recovery room afterwards or as soon as possible, to again remind their systems of its capacity to address this trauma, and continue working with them if they've had cancer surgery, for example. By the time somebody has had cancer surgery, they've had a disease. Then they've had the trauma of thinking something's really wrong, and the trauma of receiving the diagnosis, and maybe some other treatment that they've had before the surgery. Sometimes surgery is first, sometimes it's not. Every situation is different. So there's many, many layers of healing that need to be accomplished, and optimally a patient would continue to practice Reiki self-treatment. I love to train them to practice on themselves as soon as it makes sense.
Right.
In their particular scenario, and then come back and work with me or one of the professionals I've trained as they're able to.
So it sounds like a lot of what you've moved into is much more on the education side. It sounds like a lot of your passion is really just to empower other people to practice this with themselves and also to share it with other people. And a lot of it is within the context of sort of like the bigger umbrella of Western medicine. What's happening sort of like the bigger world with Reiki as a modality, as a movement? Is it moving in general into more sort of like a westernized framework, or is it just this? I'm curious because I don't really know much about the larger community.
Well, Reiki practice originated in the early 1920s in Japan. Very simple spiritual practice. The largest body of practice included meditative practices as well. And then it was brought to the US in the late 1930s by a Reiki master who had been trained by the founder and by a firstborn Japanese American who had lived in Japan and studied with him for a long time, Chujiro Hayashi and Hayao Takada. And they brought Reiki first to Hawaii. And Mrs. Takada practiced and trained until her death in December of 1980. And during that time, the practice was basically done the way she taught people to do it. She was a formidable presence, and many of my friends were trained by her. But then, within 10 years after her death, Americans did what Americans do. We improve upon everything. We make it bigger, better, longer, stronger, whatever. And in this case, without really practicing, because we don't have a cultural understanding of practice unless we're an athlete or a dancer
right.
or a musician, and then it's a different kind of practice. So Americans started changing it up. They didn't realize you learn a practice and then you practice the practice as you learned it so it can change you. That's how we relieve our suffering. That's how we grow. That's how we come to a place of love and understanding and compassion. And so they started changing the practice and making it more complicated, putting stamps on it and such. And the practice was taken up by the New Age movement. The good news is that it went all around the world. Reiki is now practiced literally in every country in the world. And the bad news is that whenever you have that kind of rapid expansion, it's at the cost of standards. So that's why I wrote my book, because there are a lot of people practicing Reiki who don't have the education that they want to have. And I'm not saying anyone who's practicing needs to change the way they're practicing, but there are a lot of people who are practicing already and they love the practice, but they know there's something else. There's a different way to understand it than the way they were taught. And the book helps with that, as well as helping the public understand what's possible.
Right. And actually share the name of the book just so people can...
Reiki, A Comprehensive Guide.
Great. So many more questions, but I want to totally respect your time. When we first spoke, which was very recently, you had just come back from an adventure. And I'd love to just kind of learn a little bit more about that and share it.
I was in Guatemala for a couple weeks at the turn of the era. Contrary to what most North Americans
right.
think, the Mayan never predicted the end of the world. It was very naive of the archaeologists or the academics who found this. The calendar ended. Well, if you found 2,000 13 calendar that ended at December, would you assume that meant that?
Right.
We were predicting the end of the world. So that's basically what happened, you know. And actually in the Mayan culture, it was a time of great celebration and looking for alignment. You know, what do I want to carry into this new age? And how do I want to grow? And what do I have to offer? And so we went there. I went with a filmmaker and a dear friend of mine, and caught up with some others while we were there. And I attended an absurd number of ceremonies in the brief period of time we were there. The fire is always an important part of their ceremonies. So I've got, 3,000 pictures, and maybe 800 of them are of the fire, different fires, and the amazing quality the fire can have. But really being in a culture that is so very different from ours. And I love that part because it reminds me of simpler values and a spirituality that is of the earth. You know, when Don Tomas and some of the other elders were here in October speaking at the UN, I got to meet them and to interview him. Don Tomas is like the Dalai Lama of the Mayan community. The Mayan community is very diverse. There are over 22 languages and dialects spoken. But in Guatemala, his group, the Quiché, is the largest. He has 150,000 people he's responsible for, 85 communities. And they are working very hard to improve the political situation, to have more recognition of the Mayan culture, more protection of their culture and their lands and such. So I was there in the thick of everything, filming, shooting, and interacting and interviewing, and at the same time, Jonathan, being in these incredibly powerful ceremonies, and feeling my own inner ground shifting enormously, and not sleeping very much at all, and moving to different locations. Nothing has moved me as deeply since I lived in India for a couple of years when I was, many decades ago, let's say, when I was quite a bit younger, before I had a family. Just a reminder of what life can be like, and not to prettify it, because life is difficult when it's simpler, but to come back to my life informed by what I experienced there, and hopefully going back.
It's got to be interesting also returning from an experience like that to the middle of New York City.
I felt so homesick when I got back. And it's odd because I love living in New York. I could leave if I wanted to, but I'm happy to be here, and it works for me. And I'm also, although I work a lot, I'm a professional and an entrepreneur in the sense that I have to let people know that this is possible, right? About Reiki practice. So I'm able to pace myself. But, and I keep my life simple, simpler than most people, but even still, I came home and I opened the door to my beautiful home. And I looked at, the first thing I thought was, I really have a lot of stuff. Wow,
It's all relative.
Yeah, a lot of things to take care of, and
yeah. So the name of this project is the Good Life Project. So when I offer that term to you, if I were to ask you, what does it mean to you to live a good life? What comes up?
A good life is what I've chosen to live. That, I think, was the value that was behind all of my choices. And a good life is a life for me of practice and grace. The practice is to keep myself aligned with the grace. And a life in which I have the company of my family and the people I love. And also a life in which I'm able to share what I've learned, my talents, my understanding, to help other people relieve their suffering. You know, I really do think we're here to help each other.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. It's been a great pleasure having you here as my guest.
Thank you.
Thanks. So I'm Jonathan Fields, and my guest today has been Pamela Miles, and signing off for the Good Life Project.